Hey there, my name is Ben Mosier and I run LearnWorthyMapping.com. It's been about 9 years since I started to learn Wardley mapping, and if you've followed me since the beginning, then you know I love to share about the changes in the practice. And plenty has changed since then, for sure. But every once in a while, I like to share what's happening with the tools, too. In fact, my first ever post about Wardley mapping tools was back in 2017. And at the beginning, I mused about kind of this paradox that on the one hand, these tools are really helpful because they can make things easier. They can help shorten the learning curve and make you more effective as a Wardley mapper. But on the other hand, the tools don't really matter at all. I mean, after all, you could just use a pencil and paper. So as I share my top 5 recommendations for Wardley mapping tools, just keep that paradox in mind, that on the one hand, these tools can be really super helpful, and on the other hand, don't take the tools too seriously. They're not the most important part of Wardley mapping. The way you learn to think is. This video is entirely my opinion. There's no data to back it up other than the experiences I've accumulated over the years. We didn't run a survey, we didn't ask the whole community. It's just me looking out and seeing what's available, what people are using, what they talk about, and also my own opinions about, what seems to work and what doesn't. So disagreement is totally welcomed and encouraged, and a lot has happened since that original 2017 tools post, which I wrote very shortly after the first MapKeep. I remember hiding in the crypt of a church in London, just totally exhausted, completely jet lagged. And I started hearing about things from other mappers that had come along and joined and shared some things. And I started writing a little post about what kinds of tools people were using. And we heard about all sorts of things, everything from blue tack and yarn to using software to actually making Wardley maps easier, all sorts of stuff. So I wrote that post, and then it's, 7 years later, and the purpose of today's exploration is less about expanding that list, because the list could go on and on and on. There are lots of different tools that people have used, but instead what I'm trying to do is offer some more clear guidance, and it's opinionated for sure, but I think it reduces the immense number of options down to 5 that I think are worth considering. Kind of casual analysis that I did was a little quick disposable 2x2 that I made to make a little bit of sense of the current options in the space. There are certainly many Wardley mapping tools out there. Most of them are not specifically designed for Wardley mapping. We're reusing existing tooling in order to make maps in them. And I realized that there's kind of 2 interesting dimensions that are worth looking at. One is ubiquity from rare to commonly available, and the other is fit for Wardley. So either it is a good fit for Wardley mapping or it's a poor fit for Wardley mapping. So I'm going from like low fit to high fit. And I'm being a little silly here, but I think that helps us understand, 1, how likely it is that a given tool will be available to you if you want to do a Wardley map, and 2, whether or not that tool will be effective in supporting you in the Wardley mapping that you're doing. So I went through each of the tools that I know of, and I kind of sorted them along these dimensions, very unscientifically. But it got me thinking, and I kind of see these clusters here that are the basis of my recommendations for today. So without any further ado, here are my personal opinionated recommendations for Wardley mapping tools in 2024. Now, as of June 2024, there are 5 that I will strongly recommend. They each fit different needs, they have different pros and cons, but I've narrowed it down to these 5 based on what I've seen and heard others using, what I personally use, and also just what seems to be useful to others, even if I don't find it useful myself. So I'm not just saying you must do what Ben does. I'm looking out and seeing what other people find useful as well. Coming in at number 5 is Old Faithful, your standard slide presentation software. We're talking about your PowerPoints, we're talking about your Google Slides, we're talking about your keynotes. These are half decent, I would say, for Wardley mapping. And they're a little high friction because they're designed to be for slide presentations and not for complex diagramming generally, although you can do it. Doesn't mean you should, but you can. What makes them really strong, though, is their ubiquity in the workplace. So regardless of whether there are weird firewalls that are up or policies or limitations on which vendors you can have, at least one of these options are going to be available to you. And also, people are used to how they work. They know how they work. They're used to making slide decks, and maybe they have to learn a little bit to get practice with the drawing and the shape tools and things like that, but they can usually pick that up pretty quickly. So to Wardley map in that software, you just add text boxes or other shapes, and then connect them with lines, nothing too wild there. And you can use templates, or you can create your own Wardley mapping backdrop in just a matter of minutes. And what's even cool is that sometimes, like with Office 365 or Google Slides, there's even a collaborative real-time aspect to it. And so that's super great, especially if you've got a distributed team or remote participants in a workshop or what have you. But even if real-time collaboration options are not available, you can still do group collaboration work in person or over a video call in slide presentation software. The key thing is to have one person sharing their screen and making the changes while everyone else is in the room discussing the map and critiquing it and so on. This is based roughly on mob programming, which is a technique for programming as a group. Woody Zuhl talks a lot about it. And there have been folks in the Wardley mapping community who have adapted it to mapping. J.D. Carlson comes to mind. I remember talking to them about this. And speaking of mob mapping, if you have a team that you would love to introduce to Wardley maps, but you're not quite sure how to get them past that initial learning curve and you want to make sure they have a good experience, David Hall and I have been working on something we're calling the Game of Wardley. And I'll leave a link to that in the description below. If you'd like to bring us in to do it with your team, just let us know at the link below and we'll be happy to help you through that. We borrow some of these concepts from mob mapping. We add some interesting collaborative gameplay elements to help people make maps together without necessarily having to have all the theory. And it's just a fun and exciting way to get started with Wardley mapping. Now, before we get on to number 4, I just want to say that presentation software is underutilized. I really think we don't make the most of it, especially since it's so accessible and ubiquitous in our workplaces. One of the things that you can use Google Slides for example, is to run live collaborative online workshops. And you could do it at a large scale too. Like I've designed a workshop before that had hundreds of people who were all collaborating, not in the same document, but we had a system for getting people into different documents, and it was a whole lovely time. They did it so well, and it's just something that is quite powerful, and I think we kind of sleep on presentation software, and it's really useful, especially if you don't have access to what we're going to talk about in number 4. All right, coming up at number 4, this is our modern obsession. Every workplace has to have it. It's real-time virtual collaboration whiteboard software. My usual for client workshops these days is Miro, but I think of it as being in relatively equal standing with similar options like Mural and Figma and FigJam and what have you, right? All of these great options that do real-time collaboration in a whiteboard style. They are designed for broad appeal, right? And so they tend to try to do everything for everyone. And they're not quite as ubiquitous as something like PowerPoint. So you have to make sure that the corporate policies are set up to allow these options if you're, for example, working with a client, or if you're trying to get approved at your employer. It can be a little bit more of a hurdle than something like Google Slides or PowerPoint. But to Wardley map in these tools, it's pretty simple, right? You just start by placing sticky notes or text boxes on the workspace. Then you connect them together with the line tools, because there's always a line tool. And you might drop in a Wardley map template image or even construct your own directly in the tool. It's not very difficult to get started with that. It can get messy sometimes, like Miro has this really irritating thing that happens sometimes with the line styles, and they're all curved and they kind of create this nasty spaghetti mess, and so you sometimes have to reformat and tweak things. That's just a function of these tools not being designed for mapping specifically, but being designed for broad appeal, broad application. So there's a little bit of friction to building Wardley maps in here, but there's still pretty decent options. The other thing I will say is that sometimes, because these are live services, and in the real-time versions of Office 365 and Google Slides technically are live services as well here, but they seem to be much more reliable. You might on occasion find that Miro or Mural or what have you crashes or is down. Sometimes they introduce bugs that are really difficult. It's becoming less and less common, but it's still something that happens, and I just find it really frustrating when it does. So that's one of the potential drawbacks of these tools. I kind of think of this as the move fast and break things kind of approach, right? They're fast moving, and their thing breakiness makes them a little bit hard to be confident in sometimes. And yet, I still seem to run lots of workshops in them, and most of the time, I would say the vast majority of the time, everything's okay. Or at least it's solved with a quick window reload or what have you, right? And if you're following along on the evolution axis in Wardley mapping, I'm at the stage 3, failure not tolerated. I get very grumpy when things fail. Real-time collaboration tools, they don't have a particularly long history, back in 2018 when I was first looking into them, because we needed solutions for running live collaborative workshops with distributed teams. And Miro was called real-time board back then, and we had even fewer options than we have today. So we're lucky to have these, but they're still relatively young, and I think that's just useful for setting your expectations about them. So I've had fewer experiences with Mural and Figma and FigJam. I've used them with clients before. They've worked fine. I tend to focus on Miro because that just seemed to be a slightly more mature product, but I think a lot could have changed in the last few years. So I think you should do your own evaluation of which of these tools is best. They're all pretty reasonable. They have great collaboration features, and if they're available to you, they're really nice to use. With that, that brings us to number 3. Number 3 has a special place in my heart because it's one of the coolest ways to make mapping that I've seen. And it was created by Damon Skellhorn, and it's onlinewardleymaps.com. It's this fabulous code-centered tool where you build maps as code, and it's purpose-built for Wardley mapping, so it's really sharply centered on meeting your needs as a mapper. And if you already are used to working in a software development tool or writing code, it's going to feel like home, right? You just define your maps using a domain-specific language that has been developed for online Wardley maps. How do you define a map with just text? Like, there are answers to all those questions. How about how you name the nodes and place the nodes and connect things together? It works really well. It's a really useful tool. So I think it's really great for software developers, data scientists, or anyone who prefers maps as code. And this way of mapping, right, you're just typing a text file, defining the map, and then that code gets rendered into an image that you can share. Now, since your Wardley maps are code in a file, you can check them into version control. And that's really cool for collaborating on a map over time in a technical domain where people are comfortable with version control, keeping track of your changes over time, as well as storing Wardley maps side by side with the source code that you might be mapping about. Those software projects can just commit those maps directly into the repository. You might give it a .wm or a .owm file extension. That seems to be what Online Wardley Maps has settled on. Especially important, though, is that Online Wardley Maps, this is really cool, it has an extension for VS Code. There's an extension for Online Wardley Maps that you can just go out and get, and you type your code and it quickly renders it in a panel, and it's great. And it's all free, which makes it extremely accessible. So if you don't want to go to onlinewardleymaps.com, you can just type directly in an IDE that you're relatively familiar with, or at least probably not too confused by, and yeah, it being in VS Code makes it extremely accessible. So super recommend this option for those who are working in technical domains, who are comfortable with writing code, and Damon Skellhorn has done this excellent job making this readily available to everyone. It's just so accessible because it's free and it's open. And that brings us to number 2, what I think is the most accessible option. And this was going to be number 1, but I realized that I think it's finally been demoted from number 1 to number 2, and that is pen and paper. So any list of tools about Wardley mapping would be incomplete without this tried and true method of Wardley mapping. Pencil, pen, paper, dry erase board, whiteboard, whatever. It's a classic, and it's here to stay. You may remember I made a bunch of paper templates, and we were handing them out at MapKeep and things like that. But you don't even need a template. You could just draw it on a piece of paper. And this is just a great option because Simon Wardley initially described mapping as something that you could do on the back of a napkin. And that's still true. A quick sketch is sometimes all you need, and it doesn't need to be pretty. You don't need to make pretty maps. You can just scribble them and half-bake them and get enough of the map down so that you can think, and then you have the realization that you needed to have, and then you can throw it away. And that's great. And I sometimes recommend pencil and paper for beginners so that they don't get distracted by the tools that are available. It can very quickly get confusing, and you get stuck trying to figure out how to use the tool versus just getting your thoughts on paper. And so I think pencil and paper can be useful for beginners if they don't mind a little bit of rote practice. That's how I did it. I don't think that rote practice and that sort of like repetitive way of doing things is the only way. I think it's an option that you can have. Remembering how to draw a map is like an exercise in itself, and it can help you reconnect with the way evolution works and the way the value chain is laid out and all that stuff. So you find yourself going, how do I draw that thing again? And you open up the book and you read the instructions from Simon Wardley about how to do it. And you're like, oh yeah, that's how. That can help you learn and start to memorize some of the concepts a little bit better. But like I said, that's not always appropriate. But it really does keep the tools from being the barrier to practice. You can just use pencil and paper, and that's always going to be valid. especially if you're in person with a colleague or if you just need to do some thinking on your own. A sketchbook, a whiteboard, these are great for making your maps. And by the way, if you like using a whiteboard, I super recommend getting some whiteboard dry erase magnets. So basically they're magnets that you can stick on the whiteboard, but you can also draw on the magnets themselves, because then you can pick those up and move them around. So I've got a couple different styles on my whiteboard that I use. If you just search dry erase magnets, you'll find exactly what I'm talking about. You can thank me later. Those are really helpful, especially as you're making lists of components and then eventually getting them arranged into a value chain and then eventually getting them arranged into a Wardley map. If you're using a dry erase board, that's a great way to sort of save yourself a lot of writing and rewriting and so on. So they're lots of fun. When in doubt, pencil and paper it out. And now I want to talk about my number one personal favorite. And this has been a long time coming, at least 3 years. And it's something created by Tristan Sleminski, and that is MapKeep, MapKeep.com. It's a real-time collaborative tool like Miro, but it's just focused on Wardley mapping. And I have to admit, I was pretty slow to adopt this. I was like, another tool, and I kind of really like my sketchbook, and Miro is good enough. And then Miro started giving me some trouble sometimes, and I was like, wow, it feels a little bit frictionful, so I should try MapKeep again. And it's repeating that process every couple months, trying MapKeep again and seeing what it's like. And here's the thing, Tristan has been adding more and more amazing features. He's been reducing the friction. And now what I'm seeing is that I'm reaching for MapKeep more and more, especially when the other tools that I like to use have a little bit too much friction or they're getting in the way of my thinking. And I had this experience just recently where I was like, I want to make a map. I don't have my notebook with me, and I really don't want to work in Miro right now. And then I just realized, all right, MapKeep. So I opened up MapKeep, and I started using it, and what I noticed is that MapKeep is near frictionless for Wardley mapping. Like it just works, and the tool really gets out of your way and just lets you make maps. And I love that. And to say the least, my initial caution about adopting MapKeep for my own personal use has been overcome by how good it feels to map with it. When I'm using MapKeep, I spend all my time thinking rather than fiddling with the tool. And of course, you might find the occasional rough edge or two. I mean, it is a new piece of software and software is hard, but Tristan keeps pushing feature after feature that just makes it easier to use and more powerful, and that just keeps happening. Most recently, Tristan introduced a list view, so you don't have any axes, no value chain, no evolution, just a list view so you can start putting components and start thinking on a blank page. And then you can switch it to a value chain view. And so you get just the value chain part of it, and you can arrange things and get them connected together into a value chain. And that just doesn't have an evolution axis, so you're just focusing on the up and down. And then you can switch it to a Wardley map when you're ready and add in evolution. So you're building up your map incrementally instead of having to do the whole thing and all the parts and all the connections and all the left, right, and up, down. So you just don't get overwhelmed. And that is how I teach people to use Wardley mapping, or how to start with it. And so I'm really excited that that's how this tool works right out of the box. Other recent features that Tristan has been pushing include things like map layers. So you can have kind of multiple versions of the same map that you're comparing and creating variations of, and like, what if it would work like this? And what if it would work like that? Or here's one point in time and here's another point in time. And I've just been loving that. Another feature has been map resizing. So like, I'm finding that it's feeling crowded and we just need a little bit more space. And so we can make it taller, we can make it wider, and it just works. It's great. And every time Tristan announces something new, I just keep finding myself having this reaction of, that's exactly what I needed. And that makes this even better. So in short, I am officially a happy MapKeep customer. Tristan didn't pay me to say this. I'm on the Villager plan, which is like $20 a month, and it gets me that real-time collaboration and public link sharing. So I'm going to start testing what it's like to do workshops in this tool in the near future. I think that this tool is great. I think you should give it a try. Tristan has earned my hearty endorsement through the quality of his product vision and all of his hard work over the last 3 years. So I think MapKeep is my number one. As a final note, just to wrap up this video, I welcome your feedback. You might disagree with my assessment, and that's totally good. You can share that in the comments and we can have a good discussion about it. I'm opinionated. I'm often wrong. However, I'm sharing my opinion with you, in order to sharpen my thinking against the whetstone of your experiences. So please share those experiences. Tell us what tools you're using and trying and what you're enjoying. And if you need any help with Wardley mapping, if you've got questions, if you want to try the game of Wardley with a team, you can always go to learnwardleymapping.com and send me a message through the contact form. I always love talking to you and hearing from you. So with that, thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a lovely time. If you need any help with Wardley mapping, visit learnwardleymapping.com. Check out the links in the description for the game of Wardley and more, and I will see you in the next one.